there's a bunch of political activities, what I would like to call advocacy activities, to be clear, that aren't actually considered political by the Canada Revenue Agency. So things that won't count towards your 10%. And that's pretty important when you think about like what are we allowed to do. And I think there's some real clarity issues, and we'll talk about at the end about some criticisms of Canada's law around this issue and some attempts to make changes. So I don't blame community organizations in any way for self-censorship, but I do think that there is a lot of like self-censoring and worrying because of the lack of clarity. And so we'll do our best to let people know that there's some rules that are kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the examples is this idea of public awareness campaigns. And who knew, public awareness campaigns, as long as you follow certain criteria, won't count towards your 10%. So what are we talking about in terms of criteria? We're talking about well-reasoned campaigns, as the Canada Revenue Agency defines them. Well-reasoned, they said, it means that the facts that you present need to be based on like factual information. You need to address the issue objectively and fully, and you need to like address any counter arguments. And then what I also found interesting was that if you're doing some kind of media campaign and there's not enough space for you to put all of that, because it could be long, right? In your media campaign, you just have to provide a way to get more information afterwards. So you'll sometimes see these campaigns that have a phone number and then there's someone just waiting on the other side of the line to give you a well-reasoned explanation for why their campaign is important.
Yeah.
Another exception is talking to government and elected politicians. So that doesn't actually count as part of your 10%. If you're going and you're arguing that you object to one of their policies or decisions, or you want to support one of their policies or decisions, because that happens too, right? Then that also won't count as long, again, as your argument is well-reasoned. And if you don't have time in your short meeting, because sometimes politicians don't have a lot of time to give a full, well-reasoned argument, you just have to forward them the documents afterwards. Yeah. And again, that won't count towards your 10%.
Yeah, and you probably want to send them the documentation anyway. And of course, the other thing to think about, it's got to be within your mandate, because you were given your charitable number because of your mandate.
Yes.
And so arguing always those points within your mandate is
very important. Yeah, making sure that you're not suddenly doing something that's completely out of your mandate and the reasons why you became a charitable organization. So if you fell under poverty, what you're addressing needs to be about poverty and connected to the work that you do.
Yeah.
And then finally, another exception is this idea of publishing or distributing whatever information you gave to the government officials. So that won't count either, as long, again, as it's well-reasoned, it's within your mandate. Unless you say somewhere, you should call James, the politician, and tell him to like change this policy or keep this policy. Unless you say that in your publication, it's not going to count towards your 10%. Yeah. So that's a whole bunch of stuff that gives you a little bit of room to maneuver. And seek social change, right?
Yeah, and really do lots of good educational work about the facts that are out there, and make sure that people who are involved in changing the laws really do hear what our opinion is. We don't need to shy away from it.
Yeah.
We just need to make sure that we frame it in a way that fits in with Canada Revenue Agency. And that's only if we are a charitable organization, right? If we're not one, then we've got all kinds of latitude.
And then, of course, just to reemphasize this, because I think folks forget, there's hundreds of thousands of nonprofit organizations in Quebec, and there's probably only about 5,000 to 10,000 charities, So a lot of people decide to just be a nonprofit because they don't want to be limited by these issues. And then just quickly, people say, well, how the heck is Canada Revenue Agency going to know what I'm doing? I mean, do they have like secret agents?
We just won't tell them.
Yeah. And then, so something important to remember is this charity information return that you put out every year. Even though the secret agent won't be visiting you, you do have to self-report. And we do know of organizations that have been, found to have not done proper reporting. And I had an interesting conversation with some folks in a workshop the other day where people were talking about how they were scared to self-report. And so sometimes people would lean towards saying, I never did anything political, in order to like avoid the scrutiny of the Canada Revenue Agency. And folks were talking about how maybe that's not necessarily the best idea, because you're allowed to do political activity. Yeah. And so if you say, I'm not doing anything, that doesn't give you the 10% maneuver.
Yeah. The other one that I've certainly seen also is people simply not filling in their report. And we know of a few organizations that's come back to haunt them, that they've had their charitable number removed because they simply stopped filing their reports for a number of years.
And it happens very quickly. And then it's something to note, actually, is that every charity is listed on the World Wide Web, on the Canada Revenue Agency website, and you can go and see whose report's been put in and whether or not they say they did political activities. So, because I'm a bit of a geek, I've sometimes done that, and I've looked at some organizations before and said, really? You didn't do any political activities? That's interesting, you know? So it's something to reflect on, how the role of Big Brother in all of this. And then just quickly, I want to address the fact that the Canada Revenue Agency allows some room for organizations depending on their income. So like I said, there's a 10% rule, but you might be able to do up to 20% of your activities as political activities depending on your annual income. And that breakdown is in our info sheets, and you can take a look at it and see how much your income is and what the rules are for you in particular.
And generally, if you're smaller, they allow a larger percentage.
Exactly.
Of political activities.
Yeah, and the idea was a concern for fairness, so that a smaller organization wouldn't have such a small amount of money that they could put into political activities. Another thing that folks ask me is like, well, what if this year there's the mega issue, the one issue that's really going to affect your organization, and you need to spend a little bit more? That you can actually ask the Canada Revenue Agency for an exception if this is especially if you haven't used up all of your amounts in the last years. You can take the amounts that you haven't used up, and then if they give you permission, apply those for this particular year. So that's something to look a little bit more, and you can find it in your info sheet. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So there's lots within the Canada Revenue Agency, lots of documentation around it. There's also more information on legal limitations that we can refer people to.
There sure is. And I really urge you to check out the info sheet. It's a little bit of the lengthier ones, and it's kind of packed with info for you to find out a little bit more clarity and detail. And then something that's really important for us is COCo is talking about criticizing this policy decision law of government. So that's our political activity that we're doing right here, and thinking about, like, why do we have these limitations? Why do we choose these particular rules? And we're inspired by the work of other organizations. The Voluntary Sector Initiative was a partnership between community organizations all over Canada and the government, looking at some of the problems with these rules and with other issues affecting community orgs, and that's something to check out. And there's an organization that was called Impacts, which was the Institute for Media, Policy and Civil Society, and they did a lot of work in their Charities and Democracy project around criticizing these rules. And something that I think that's interesting to think about is in the States and in the UK, the rules are different. So in the States, often up to 20% of your activities can be political, so they have a 20% rule.
Yeah.
And in the UK, they have a 49% rule. So up to 49% of your activities can be political. So we want to keep alive this debate about why we have these types of limitations in Canada and what it would look like to change them.
Yeah. So if you're in Quebec, you're a charitable organization, and you'd like to push this discussion a little bit further, we'd love to connect with you and see how we can partner around the issue.
We sure would.
Meanwhile, thinking about how do we really look at the use of limitations or opportunities when you're a charitable organization, we'll refer you back to the CRA website and what's there. And also we have, you can see here from Impacts, a really great document that they have
in our resource library.
That challenges, and that's also on the website?
It is on the website, and you can see the link right there. And there's a couple of interesting criticisms to take a look at. And like Francis said, we'd love it if you give us a call to talk more about this if you're trying to figure it out. And if you're trying to advance a critique.
And the last little one I just want to mention, because a lot of groups that I've been speaking with over the last number of years, ethnocultural groups, really challenged in terms of looking how they can get their charitable number. And there's a really good statement that's come out of Canada Revenue Agency, policy statement on ethnocultural groups trying to get a charitable number. And so here it is. You need to refer to that if it affects you.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, Francis. It's a great document that really walks through how groups working with ethnocultural people can get charitable status even if their work may seem political. It really spells out what kind of language you would need to use in order to get charitable status, and that's after a lot of pressure from organizations, a whole coalition of organizations working with ethnocultural groups that said, this is a problem, we've got to address it. So check that out.
So if you want to be a charity, you are a charity, you need to be looking at this closely. Remember, lots of us are doing great political work, and we're not a charity. We've made a choice to go a different route.
For sure. And lots of charities are finding ways to do the work that they need to do and do the political work that they need to do within the rules that exist. Thanks so much.
Thanks.